Welcome to the European Sport Congress podcast, where we discuss sport projects and priorities with amazing guests who are leading sport innovation. If you like this content, make sure to subscribe and to follow the European Sport Congress on social media. Joining us today, we have Phyllis Ellis, director of the documentary category Women. Phyllis is an independent filmmaker and Olympian who played for the Canadian hockey team. Nominated for the 2021 International Emmys and winner of Best Direction and Best Writing at the Canadian Screen Awards, Phyllis' work addresses themes of justice, truth, transformation, and human rights. Phyllis, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great. Thanks so much for having me.
So, before I get ahead of myself, during this podcast, we will be talking about your documentary category Women, which follows four champion runners from the global south, Annette, Dodi, Evangeline, and Margaret, to portray how, quote, international sport governing bodies rule that identified female athletes must medically alter their healthy bodies under the guise of fair play. Now, for me, it's very interesting as with a background on data and on research to find these topics of inclusion and gender equality so deeply vocalized in this documentary. How did the idea of category woman came to be?
I always it's a good question because category woman existed long before the film. With the athletes' stories and their lives and what has transpired and happened in not only athletics but other sports around the world. Um, I was an athlete and thought one day as a filmmaker I would come back and I would, you know, uh, uh, do a film about something in some sort of the sports space. And I had followed Miss Semenia's, Caster Semenia's story since '09 when all of that happened to her at the World Championships. And a great friend of mine, Dr. Bruce Kidd, who's here in Toronto, introduced me to Peoshni Mitra, Dr. Peoshni Mitra, who's an activist, advocate, sport for women in sport, and we got to know each other. And she introduced me to some of the athletes. And sometimes a film just starts talking back to you. So the film just, the story, and then it seemed like an important story. Well, it was an important story to tell and to really get out of the way and let the athletes sort of tell the story themselves with the experts and advocates and scientists that we had the opportunity to get to know.
Mm. I found it very interesting because I've been hearing some things from you, and you did say that there's a fine line between portraying, not appropriating others' culture and others' experience, but
Yep.
still giving voice to their experience, which you've done really well, I would say, in this documentary. How
Yeah,
was it to walk this line between these two?
yeah,
These like,
that's a really good question too, because we have this common ground as athletes, and you know if you've been an Olympian, when you meet an Olympian, you sort of understand each other on some level. It doesn't matter where you're from, in the world. However, um, my lived experience as a person living in Canada, um, and while we all experienced difficult things as women athletes, it's not like living in the global South and being from, as Greg Knott, the lawyer in the film, says, one of the poorest, villages in the country, and what sport means and how it's defined from your lived experience. So it was really an incredible experience for me to get to know the athletes in the film. Um, but I knew at the very beginning and quite intuitively, and also with a lot of conversations with Peoshni, just to kind of step out of the way and let the stories lead themselves. And I think that's why people are moved and affected and inspired maybe by the stories in the film.
one of the things, and you just said about how sport is differently felt, but still, I find it very interesting. And we were just mentioning it, how still every Olympian that I know, at least, despite everything that they've been through, and even these women, despite what they've been through, there's still this passion for sport,
Mhm,
for running, and for practicing it.
mhm.
Where do you think they find this strength to carry on doing despite everything they've been through?
Well, I mean, individually, the athletes in the film, they would best answer that question specifically, to directly to their own lives. It's almost monomaniacal. You once it grabs you, sport. Um, it's and if you know that's your life's purpose, that's your life's purpose. And you know, people often say, what's your fallback plan if you don't make the Olympics, or what's your fallback plan? Well, when you're an athlete at that level, your fallback plan is I'm an athlete at that level, and your fallback plan to that is I'm a high performance athlete. So there isn't a fallback plan.
Yeah.
But in from what I learned and had the great privilege of getting to know the women in the film, plus of course in speaking with Dr. Mitra, um, it's a combination of so many things. It's a a a way to be celebrated. An enormous amount of place where people draw great pride in the global south, the African and South African athletes, Duty Chan from India. There's this national pride that when you're competing for your country, but not only that, it's their livelihood. They support their families, they support their communities. They're huge role models for other young people from their villages. And so there's this entire sort of other level of pride, I think, and national pride, and how the country sort of supports um, great athletes in other countries. I think we support great athletes here, but not in the same way, and
Yeah,
certainly not women
nothing is
as
definitely.
much.
There was, well, you just mentioned something very interesting in the documentary. There is, I think it is Evangeline who says, I am a great role model for my brothers. And I think that that responsibility towards the others, it's also, well, it's fascinating to see that they still carry it. And
Mm.
the responsibility that they have to be good role models, it's also very
Well,
interesting.
I think that's also too, it's their job, it's their livelihood. It's what they're going to do, with this, sort of period of time in their life. And when that's taken away, and even more so now with the new regulations, certainly in athletics. So, the 400 to the 3 or whatever it was, and now all of the athletes are taken off the track or off the field. Um, you take that's where human rights violations or human rights conversations come into play, because you're taking away someone's livelihood. And the other thing too, excuse me, when you look at why, and I think it's Margaret says, I'm not going to take any medication, I'm not sick.
Exactly.
I'm not sick, there's nothing medically wrong with me. So it's a very complicated, but one of my favorite lines in the film, Jim Bunting, who's a lawyer from Toronto, and he worked with Peoshni, Dr. Mitra, and others on the Duty Chan case, and then also represented Miss Smenia. And they just won, actually, the human rights case. Doesn't mean she's going to get back on the track, but it's a big win. He says this story is complicated in the science, but simple in the humanity. And I think that's sort of the fault line that happens with this particular situation.
Yeah. You have many great quotes in the movie. I remember one from Paushny, Dr. Paushny, which is, when men are good, they are supermen, but when women are good, they must be men.
Mhm.
And this is just, it really hit me. But what you are doing as well, um, vocalizing these stories, sharing them, it's also a way to empower these women. Do you feel it that way? Do they feel it that way?
Yes, I think, for example, Annette Nagesa, I mean, she's the first athlete and woman-identified person in the world to tell her story, to tell this story, and there are several athletes that, have similar stories to Annette and variations on the story. From in speaking with Annette and the other women in the film, um, that's what a film does. It's not like their story is what makes the film
Yeah,
powerful. Yeah, there's craft, and I can edit and put. I have beautiful composer who sang. But it's the power of their stories, and I think that when you have a voice and and it's um, sort of spread, and that's what film does too. It puts all these great people in one place, so the film can sort of move with the stories all in one place. And I think when it's also really interesting when they connect, all the different stories connect in one place as well. You can really see how the impact of what's happened to each one of them individually, but then it becomes sort of this ubiquitous situation.
yeah, we can definitely see a pattern, unfortunately,
Yeah,
in what happens.
yeah.
But as we
You
were
don't have
just mentioning, there is a good outcome for it. I mean, I'm sure that your movie sparked a lot of discussion. It sparked a lot of debate about it. I've been hearing people talking about it, not from me, and people are talking about it in the sport industry, which is great. And we can see what just happened. Like the European Court of Human Rights just launched the verdict that it's positive for so many. At least it's not this. It's not a bad one. So
no, it's a great decision, and it validates and validates it outside of CAS or the sort of the sport mafia or whatever you want to call it, that sort of umbrella of autonomous power that seems to, you know, dare I say, sort of a male-dominated kind of,
it
you know,
is a male
white
dominated.
white male-dominated. I can say that openly. And I take that sort of patriarchal uh, um, autonomous vacuum of sport, which they operate in kind of this space, and it opens it up to the world so that the world sees that this decision is outside of that, and this decision is final. The unfortunate thing for so many athletes, and it's, as I said, it's many different sports now are adopting and implementing these regulations. Hundreds of athletes, and how many of these athletes, many will not compete in Paris, because I don't unless a miracle happens between now and miracles happen. Not in a religious way, but something extraordinary um, happens. A lot of these athletes will not compete in Paris, and athletes have a shelf life. We do. There's a window of time when you're sort of at your peak performance, and the longer they keep these athletes off the track or off the field or out of the pool or around off the bike, um, the harder it will be for them to continue to compete. And it's also really egregious, changing the rules all the time. Well, you have to have this testosterone, 10 nanomoles, 5 nanomoles. You can only compete. You can't compete in the 4, the 8, the mile, and so some athletes switch to the 3, or some athletes switch to the 200 meters. And now it's like, oh, sorry. Now that you've made this big effort, and you're winning medals, and you have the potential to win a medal in Paris. Oh, sorry. We're just going to take you all off, and none of you are going to be able to compete. So you can't keep changing the rules,
Mhm.
just to suit uh, whatever works to eliminate. It's one thing for to have the new framework, and to say, "Oh, yes, we're all about bodily autonomy and inclusion and fair play and safe space." But when then the sport governing bodies have their own autonomy.
Yeah.
So it's like the Vatican, and then there's all these archdioceses, and it's here, you go ahead and do whatever you want. We'll interfere if there's a problem. But what we'd like you to do is we're going to have this fair, we're not going to discriminate. Everybody's welcome. But within each individual sport governing body, they have the autonomy to clean it out, clear house. So what I think at the top, they're saying, okay, you go clean it up so that by the time you get to the games, we're good. We don't have to sex test. We don't have to gender test. We don't have to fem test. We don't have to do anything but doping testing. But,
Yeah.
that's another place where I think, you know, that's another conversation. Mm.
Yeah, and even when they are allowed to play, but they do have to take the medicine, for instance, and we see it in the documentary. The performance changes completely. They're changing their bodies, so they
Yeah.
cannot do it in the same way anyhow.
No, and I think, but to be very clear, whatever choice an athlete makes in order to compete, I remember, and I mean, I wasn't making this kind of decision, but certainly we were sex tested, and there were athletes that, if you failed the sex test or the gender test or fem test or whatever it was when I was a kid, at different competitions, they put a cast on your foot and said you hurt your ankle, and they would send you home. But the effect, the long term effect of not understanding what a sex test was, two, not understanding what the ramifications were, and being afraid to even go back to compete. And this is in, like, let's say, early 80s. Um, and I mean, from whatever it was, 1968 to 2000, moving on with the Olympics until, I don't know, like '09, a little bit longer, 2009. Every athlete from every sport, women athletes only in every sport, winter and summer, were sex tested. So I mean, and it blew up, of course, with what happened with Castor, but there were athletes prior to Castor,
Okay.
and then things shifted over to testosterone, and then, as we see in the film, with the experts and activists and the athletes, race does play a part in
Yes.
race and gender discrimination, human rights violations.
Of course, yeah. Just going a bit back to those tests, I remember one thing in the movie that really struck me, which is when in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, sorry, when women had to parade naked in front of a bunch
Mm.
of male doctors for them to decide if they were women or not.
Well,
That
it went through all kinds of different iterations, but I think it was yeah, it was in the late 60s, mid 66, 67, I think, and then 68 they added I think the, there was another kind of test, but yeah. And it
yeah,
wasn't just male doctors, it was female doctors too, but and I think
having somebody looking at you and saying who you are.
or your chest is too flat, or you have hair on your chest, or your body is too muscular, or whatever their criteria was. But if you look at some of the criteria in the early regulations, the first round, pretty pretty vile, looking at the structure of someone's body. And I
Yeah,
think one of the most sort of, we have this Eurocentric ideal about everything, beauty and bodies and women, and how we perceive um, humans, really. And it's North American too, but it's sort of, and and beauty standards and standards are a public health issue. And when it gets somehow wrapped into sport, like, we're not saying, "Whoa, geez, LeBron James is really ugly, so I don't think he should," or the 7-foot basketball player. Well, let's just cut him off at the knees because he's too tall. And in men and women, it's not just men, but back to what Peoshni said, they must be men. And I had this, uh, well, there was Usain Bolt who won by the 200 by half a track in 2009, and then Caster Semenya wins by, however much she won by, and she gets vilified and her entire career gets blown to to bits. But I had this footage and I couldn't use it, dare I say, of, Sebastian Coe when he was, an extraordinary runner. I mean, he was a phenom. He was, I think Kazarkas says it in the film, every so often, an extraordinary athlete comes along and changes the sport forever. And I would say Sebastian Coe uh, was one of those athletes.
Okay.
Absolutely. But you see him in one of his races and he's running and he's literally half a track ahead or almost double the spread that Miss Semenya had, or always it usually has. And I thought, but it's okay for him to win by half a track, but it's not okay for this extraordinary also athlete that really changed, one of the greatest athletes, in my opinion, of our generation,
Yeah,
Caster Semenya.
what Caster Semenya is doing also, it's amazing because she's not submitting, and we know how difficult that is at a personal
Yeah.
and social level, but she's not doing it. She's really standing out for everything.
She's just a remarkable human, as are the other women in the film. Like I look at what Annette Nagasa went through
Yeah.
and escaping Uganda, getting to to Kenya, and then with the help of this German production team, getting to Berlin, um, and it, just an extra. And Dr. Mitra was also part of that, and then leaving your entire country. So this is what people, when I break it down and say, okay, she's a young person. She's 18 years old. You see her at that age in the film. She's at the top of her life. She's from a small village. She's athlete of the year in Uganda. She's preparing for the London Olympics, the greatest moment she's going to have, and maybe 4 or 5 more Olympics, 3 Olympics after that. And then she gets knocked down, taken, has an operation to alter her perfectly healthy body without the complete understanding. Then she's told to hide. Then she is too afraid to come out because in Uganda, when you're othered, you could die or get put in jail. So it's not even like, oh, people call her a name or people, this is like life or death. Life or death, not just for her though, for her family as well. And I remember at one point, she contacted Payoshni and she was working in some random construction site, far into Uganda, um, sort of hiding, making next to nothing. Um, and then they got her out, and that's fine. Isn't it great? She's a refugee, political seeks asylum in Germany, but the cost of that is she can never go home again. She's completely isolated. She has to learn a new language to find employment, gainful employment. And because of the fact that they did not provide her with lifetime hormone treatment, after 10 years of literally no hormones, she has to build that back up with with estrogen, progesterone, and other things. And it's and that is ultimately to run around a track twice.
Yeah.
It's destroying someone's entire life and future. Now, she's extremely strong human. Excuse me, and she, is advocating now. She's working with younger athletes. She's speaking out. She went from, very broken to just being, sort of a powerhouse and being able to tell her story so that it wouldn't happen to anyone else again.
Yeah, as you said, they are champions. They are not athletes. They are champions.
Big
And
time, big time champions, and I was so honored to meet all of them. You know what? I would have crumbled. I think I'm so strong, and I was just this, I was fighting for the rights, women's rights, athletes' rights, and everything as a kid. I am not sure that I would have had the strength and the courage and just the confidence and um, all of the sort of advocacy that they had, and the courage to speak out like that. I'm not sure I would have had it. I may have crumbled under the pressure.
Yeah,
So
I
it's
completely feel you.
incredible. Yeah.
These women are amazing. And this takes a toll not just on your social life, on your family life. This takes a huge toll on your mental health as well, obviously. And even for athletes that don't go through this, we know that being an Olympian, it's an extreme pressure. What do you think
Yeah.
organizations can do to help with this, of what being an athlete encompasses?
I think that's a fantastic question. And Alison Carlson, who was part of, she's in the film as well with Dr. Janelle. She was part of the advisory committee in the 80s, and and uh, and onward, advising the Olympic Committee. They had a group of experts, um, which of course they said to eliminate sex testing and that all women should that identify should compete. But one of the things she said was every athlete and coach and sports scientist and physiotherapist, probably sport administrators, should be educated. So every time you come into high performance sport on whatever level, we're educated
Yep.
about inclusion, but not just about inclusion, to understand actually what um, the biology is and what the science is and what it actually means. Because I think that one of the most dangerous things is having an opinion, an uneducated opinion that
Making the
is
decisions.
and based out of fear, and the idea that this is going to destroy women's sport forever. When women is women's sport that fragile? That this is going to 5 athletes, 20 athletes are going to destroy women's sport forever, and that somehow, and Dr. Mitra always says this too, somehow we need protection. Are we that fragile? We're feminists, we're women, we fought this hard to get this far. I hardly think we need protection. What we need is a safe space to compete, not to be protected from harm. What we need is not to have harm in the first place. And primacy to bodily autonomy, inclusion, and a safe space to compete for all athletes. And I realize there's two categories, and I don't know what the future of that is, but right now, women identified, men identified athletes competing in all sports, and you know women's rights, athletes' rights, human rights. You cannot violate someone's human rights in whatever space you're in. And when sport, implies that human rights don't apply. Now, I realize there's the Center of Human Rights, and a lot of work has been done in this space. And I also want to say, that there's extraordinary um, work has been done for women in sport. I mean, I just think of the advance even since when I was an athlete and the opportunities that women have. But what are the opportunities in the global north versus the global south?
Yep.
And I think that's also, they talk about fair play and leveling the playing field. Well, leveling the playing field, as Dr. Kidd says, would be to take every athlete to one country. I think he picked one, I can't remember. Every athlete from every sport goes. All have equal nutrition, equal medical, equal coaching. Everybody for 2 years, and then you go to the Olympics, and then you see,
Yep.
that's leveling the playing field. And anyway, what's a level playing field? There's extraordinary athletes, there's phenoms, and then there's people that aren't that good that come 10th. That's what sport is. You
Exactly.
win or you lose.
Exactly, because when they talk about protecting women, I always get a bit confused because these women are not being protected. They are protecting a very selected group of women, not
Mhm.
everybody. So that's not very inclusive. But as you mentioned it, things are changing a bit. There are some
Yeah.
advancements. Could you name a few of the ones that you think have made the biggest positive impact?
Well, I think, the fact that Dr. Mitra and the athletes are speaking out and that they're, the space is being created. Even you and I speaking today, that space is being created. Um, I think, the studies that Human Rights Watch has initiated. I think certainly the new framework, the new IOC framework, opens the door for the conversations. I think obviously having the Center for Human Rights in Sport is, extremely important. I think when you have international conversations about this, I think um, uh, there are um, spaces that are created to have this conversation. It's not in the corners or underneath or buried anymore. I think, you know, what happens is that actually I screened a film last weekend in Toronto, and I hadn't watched it since I finished it. Just because I watch a film and you think of all the things that you wish you'd done, and but what I find, even for a general audience that are non-athletes that don't even understand the world of international sport at all, um, one is we had no idea this kind of thing happened in sport. And two, what can we do?
Yeah.
Like, what is the call to action? And I think that, the film has just kind of started to, and we wanted it to have kind of a touchdown in different countries. And I think now it's probably time for it to move in a faster way, maybe to broadcasters and to be seen on television or streamers or however people watch stuff now. Um, but I think mostly, um, you think the courage of the athletes, but also Peoshni. I mean,
Yeah.
she traveled all over the world, often at her own expense. She's still doing it. She's working with athletes from different sports right now in African countries. Um, she works tirelessly in this space. So when you have someone vocal like that, that is stepping forward, um, and then you see the extraordinary experts, scientists that are dispelling the myth about chromosomes, and people always get freaked out when you start talking about identity, um, but or
Creating
gender identity.
creating this space. I think that that's very, very interesting because, for instance, as Dr. Prashni is doing, she created the World Observatory Center, which collects data on all of this. And as I was saying, we also work with a lot of data, for instance, and we know how long we still have to go until gender equality with women in coaches, women in the media, and everything. But what you did, for instance, is another very interesting way of, as you said, getting to other people, making it even more aware, and doing it in a very emotional way. That we know that sometimes communication has to be like that for people to actually understand the depth of the problem in this case. So, what are your expectations and what you think now to achieve with the documentary now that it's out and about?
I think you always want as many people to see it as possible, and the reason is one, so that they know these women's names, they know this story, um, and the more people know, the more change can happen. I think film can be a great tool for impact and for change. Um, I know one film that I did, had an international impact, and took a product off the shelves that will then subsequently save women's lives. not because of the film, but because the film was used as a vehicle, and it was a conversation piece, and it was a many, many people saw it, and so then they started to call and put pressure on governments and Senate and whatever. But to say all of this, um, there have been people, like I've mentioned, working in this space long before the film, but what the film is like a tool or a vehicle. It's very easy, you know? I think, and then, what can the film do to contribute to the conversation and support these regulations being abolished? I think
Exactly.
that would,
Sorry.
you know,
Now that we're talking about regulations, I would like to ask you, as you said that people ask as well, what can we as a society do to ensure that dignity and safety and privacy of the bodies can be can be kept, can be a right that is actually respected?
uh, well, in sport, I guess, it's on many levels. I think parents and educators teach young people they no is not a sentence, or no is a sentence. Period. You can say no. Like, we don't, as athletes, you sometimes don't feel that you even have the autonomy to say no. You're in this like weird bubble, and there's so much that's at stake that if you rock the boat, maybe you'll get cut from the team, or maybe they won't. And it's so important. But to tell young people from the very early age that they can say no
Mhm.
to anything that they're uncomfortable with. So I think it starts when when young children are starting to participate in sport. Um, And then, sort of as it moves up is the education within the sport. And I think when we get to the top, advocacy and change. I mean, I think we need a lot of diverse women um, that are operating at the highest level of sport, because I think that would make a big difference in the decision making.
Thankfully, see that things are
Yeah,
changing a bit. That we
yeah,
have more and more women
yeah.
in decision-making positions. Finally, Phyllis, you will be here at the European Sport Congress. We will be screening the documentary to all the participants and also to the local institutions. What are your expectations for this event?
Oh, that's a great question. Open reception, great conversation. Um, you know, even differing of opinions, uh, challenging opportunities that have resolution, and people to be open to the stories in the film, and because I don't care what anybody says about. Well, I do care about a lot of things, but you know, you look at these human beings and what they've experienced in sport. It's untenable to think that this actually has happened, and that it exists and that it continues. So what is the solution? And I think like a larger debate, but also to be received as a filmmaker. I'm not an expert in this field. I'm an artist who was an athlete who chose this story to tell, but I'm not a scientist or a doctor or an activist even. I'm an advocate and an ally.
Well, Phyllis, thank you so much for joining us today, and I can't wait to host you in Gijón
Thank
and to
you.
share your documentary with everything. And thank you so much for the ideas that you've shared with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and, yeah, I'll look forward to seeing you soon. So, see you.
Great, thank you.
Bye.
The European Sport Congress brings together stakeholders from all over Europe to showcase their work, connect with potential partners, and learn from the experts. In this September, and you can find all the information and register at www.sportcongress.eu.